So there is no doubt that Homage to Catalonia is by some considerable margin the most widely read memoir of all the British volunteers who fought in Spain. And it's most people's introduction to the Spanish Civil War, as indeed it was mine. However, Orwell, of course, was not the only volunteer to go to Spain, and he was not the only volunteer to write an account of his time in the war, and indeed of the tumultuous events in Barcelona in May 1937. Now, while later speakers today are going to be talking more about Orwell himself, his role with the POUM, and the impact of the book Homage to Catalonia when it came out, I want to begin today's session by looking at the experiences of, rather different experiences and perceptions of another group of volunteers who were fighting in Spain at the same time as Orwell as part of the International Brigades. Now, the views expressed in many of their accounts of their experiences in Spain, on the impact of the street fighting in Barcelona in May 1937, and indeed on Orwell and his comrades in the Independent Labour Party group, I think they provide a fascinating, if not to say contentious, backdrop to the events described in Homage to Catalonia. So, while Orwell and his comrades serving the POUM militia were freezing to death on an Aragon hillside, the British Battalion of the 15th International Brigade were faring little better. In the spring of 1937, the volunteers were languishing in the trenches in the Jarama Valley, about 30 kilometres southeast of Madrid, which was the scene of vicious and bitter fighting earlier in the year. In their first taste of action, during 3 days of fighting between the 12th and the 14th of February 1937, the battalion was effectively annihilated. Of the 630 men who had gone into action on the first day of the battle, only 80 were left unscathed when the battle ended 3 days later. There were further heavy casualties later in the month, when an absolutely disastrous attack was launched, or attempted to be launched, on the strongly held positions facing them. Any attempts to go over the top were met with a hail of well-directed machine gun fire, so many of the volunteers simply refused to advance, and those that tried were cut to pieces. A deadlock developed on the Jarama front, which saw the Republican rebel forces construct increasingly well-protected trenches. Nevertheless, the loss of life continued, with snipers in particular taking a steady toll. And the dangerous reality of life in the trenches was made immeasurably worse by the appalling weather during March and April of 1937. It rained relentlessly for long periods, making it virtually impossible to ever get warm and dry. And the insanitary conditions in the trenches meant that, inevitably, there were outbreaks of disease, such as scabies. Of greater concern were typhoid and dysentery, which had the potential, of course, to substantially weaken the battalion's fighting ability. Now, while new arrivals went some way towards restoring the battalion's numbers, repairing the damage inflicted on morale by the appalling level of casualties was a very different matter. A handwritten note by the Scottish Battalion Commissar, George Orwell, acknowledged both the loss of morale and its obvious causes. "Many comrades," he said, "are beginning to show signs of exhaustion and nervous strain. The signs of nervous strain on the part of many is no doubt partly due to the fact that the vast majority of the leading forces in the battalion have been killed or wounded since the beginning of the present action." One volunteer explained that particular disillusionment developed from the realisation that somewhat rash promises made in London of repatriation following a fixed period of service were unlikely to be able to be fulfilled. He says, "It was only now that people began to realise that nothing had been said in King Street about coming home, or even being given local leave, and no one had time to think of it before. Now that the battalion had been reduced to the level of a mere holding force on an active front, we began to feel that the granting of leave was possible and that we deserved it. Approximately 800 men had passed through the battalion between the 15th of February and the 15th of March, and now less than 200 men were left in the line. None of us had enjoyed a night's sleep out of uniform or a decent hot meal for several months. There was no relief from the continual fear produced by snipers and occasional mortar shells. We began to feel that we were in a trap from which there was no escape. Faced with the very real prospect of being killed, a number of volunteers took the decision to leave the front without permission. As a senior figure in the battalion admitted, some grumbled and groused, some begged for leave, some took it without asking. However, on the 29th of April, after 75 days on the front, the members of the battalion were informed that they were finally being taken out of the line. Withdrawn to Alcalá de Henares, about 30 kilometres east of Madrid, a decent meal was most people's priority, though a small number apparently took the opportunity to get blind, paralytic drunk. But only 5 days later, the members of the battalion were informed that their leave had been cancelled and that they were to be immediately returned to their former positions on the Jarama front. The volunteers were devastated, and the abrupt cancellation of their much-needed period of leave undoubtedly caused great resentment. Meanwhile, Orwell and a group of independent Labour Party volunteers were in another set of trenches high in the hills near Zaragoza, 250 kilometres west of Barcelona. As Orwell himself recounts, he'd been rather disappointed to discover that he'd been sent to what another British volunteer described as a quiet sector on a quiet front. By April 1937, the lack of action had begun to frustrate some of the group. Orwell and Stafford Cotman, a young volunteer originally from Southampton, felt that they had come to Spain to fight fascists, not to be shot whilst foraging for firewood on the hillside. So the pair discussed the prospect of joining the International Brigades. Many of their comrades tried to talk them out of leaving, but as Stafford Cotman put it, Madrid was the place under attack, and we had a comradely duty to help. Here we were on the Aragon front with very little happening. You saw the enemy miles over there as a little moving dot on the landscape. You really didn't feel as though you were making a useful contribution to the Spanish Civil War. Therefore, when the ILP group were pulled out of the line on the 25th of April and sent on leave to Barcelona, Orwell approached what he termed as a communist friend attached to the Spanish medical aid in Barcelona to inquire about joining the International Brigades. Asked to see if other members of the column could be persuaded to come with him, Orwell agreed to talk to his comrades. 2 days later, Orwell spoke to a senior British communist in Barcelona, Walter Tapsell, previously the circulation manager for the Daily Worker, who had later served with the British Battalion as a political commissar. Tapsell had been instructed by the Communist Party to mingle with the ILP members, and he discussed with Orwell the prospect of him joining the International Brigades. A confidential report was sent to the British Communist Party General Secretary, Harry Pollitt, describing Orwell's disaffection. The leading personality and most respected man in the contingent at present is Eric Blair. This man is a novelist with a capital N and has written some books on proletarian life in England. He has little political understanding and, so he says, he is not interested in party politics and came to Spain as an anti-fascist to fight fascism. As a result of his experiences, however, he has grown to dislike the POUM and is now awaiting his discharge from the POUM militia. However, as Orwell of course reveals in Homage to Catalonia, events quickly overtook any desire to leave the POUM militia to join the International Brigades. On their arrival in Barcelona, the British ILP section had found the city to be in a state of high tension and much change from the Barcelona that Orwell had so famously described the previous January, when the working class had been in the saddle. Instead, by May 1937, Orwell discovered that the militia uniform and the blue overalls had almost disappeared. Everyone seemed to be wearing the smart summer suits in which Spanish tailors specialise. Fat, prosperous men, elegant women, and sleek cars were everywhere. Propaganda for the new Republican Popular Army had replaced that for the militias. Government attempts to restore centralised authority in the Republican zone, which had seen a virtual collapse of the state apparatus following the Rising, were receiving strong support from the Communist Party, who of course had their own reasons for wanting to limit the power of the anarchists and their militias. Now, as I'm sure everybody here is well aware, street fighting broke out on the 3rd of May 1937 when the government attempted to take over the Telefonica, the Barcelona telephone exchange, held by members of the anarchist trade union, the CNT. When the local police chief sent 3 lorry loads of civil guards to remove them, the occupants refused to admit them. Shots were exchanged, and anarchists across Barcelona, supported by members of the POUM, who were fearful that the government was preparing to roll back their revolutionary gains, erected barricades and prepared to defend themselves. Meanwhile, communists seized their opportunity by accusing the POUM of being agents of Franco. Peter Harrison, a British Communist Party member and journalist from Portsmouth, witnessed the vast violence in Barcelona, having travelled to Spain in late April, driving a lorry full of vermicide, an insecticide for killing lice. As he waited for papers permitting him to carry on to the International Brigade base at Albacete, he saw a large crowd gathering outside the telephone exchange, where he was told there had been some shooting. Harrison described how he was warned that there had been a revolt by the revolutionary FAI, the anarchists, and the Trotskyist POUM against the Catalan government and the communists. Safe inside the British Medical Union flat in Calle Balmes, Harrison watched on as he described it, an anarchist armoured car appeared at the top of Balmes, coming our way, firing indiscriminately to keep up its spirits. From our 4th floor balcony, we would watch it slowly approach the barricade and drive past, slowly raking it with machine gun fire, while the police and other government supporters would reply with all the weapons they possessed and try to roll hand grenades beneath the armoured car. To add to the sound of battle, snipers on the roofs around would join in. Meanwhile, caught up in the fighting on the other side of the barricades, Orwell and the other members of the British ILP group helped defend a number of the POUM's buildings. During 6 days of street fighting, they watched on as hundreds lost their lives and many more were arrested. The battles only ended on the 6th of May, when 6,000 Republican assault guards arrived in the city and the barricades began to be dismantled. Not surprisingly, the street fighting put pay to Orwell's wish to join the communist-dominated international brigades. Whilst Walter Tatzel apparently still believed that a number might be persuaded to join, his attempts were summarily rejected by the ILP volunteers, who were incensed by communist portrayals of the POUM as fascist agents. They probably correctly surmised that they would be seen as politically unreliable within the international brigades. So on the 10th of May, the group returned to the Huesca front as part of the 29th Division of the Republican Army. Back in their trenches on the Jarama front, the men in the British Battalion received accounts of the fighting in Barcelona from their political commissars and from the communist newspaper, The Daily Worker. As early as the 6th of May, the paper was carrying stories accusing anarchists of precipitating the street fighting by their seizure of the telephone exchange rather than their defence of it. The Daily Worker reporter, Claude Coburn, writing under his pseudonym Frank Pitcairn, accused the anarchists and the POUMistas of being armed with weapons which they had been stealing for months past, including tanks, which they stole from the barracks just at the beginning of the rising. The calumny was repeated by Ralph Bates, a senior British figure in Spain working with the Republican government's propaganda and information services. He visited the battalion at Jarama and lectured the volunteers on the disorders in Catalonia. As one Manchester volunteer confirmed, Bates' speech made it absolutely clear to all that POUM, Trotskyists and spies engineered it. In a particularly virulent article published in the Daily Worker on the 11th of May, entitled Pitcairn Lifts Barcelona Veil, Claude Coburn claimed that German and Italian agents, in cooperation with local Trotskyists, were preparing a situation of disorder and bloodshed. He went on to claim that the POUM, acting in cooperation with well-known criminal elements, planned, organised and led the attacks in the rearguard, accurately timed to coincide with the attack on the front of Bilbao. In the plainest terms, the POUM declares it is the enemy of the people's government. To further damn the POUM, an interview with the ILP volunteer Franco given to Sam Lesser, the former international brigader working as a radio broadcaster in Barcelona, appeared in the Daily Worker. It was deliberately edited to appear as though Frankfurt was accusing members of the POUM of fraternisation, and included the utterly unfounded claims that arms for the May uprising had been supplied by the nationalists. Not surprisingly, as the political commissar Bel Alexander, you heard mention of earlier, later described, news of the fighting was greeted with incredulity, consternation, and then extreme anger by the international brigaders. The battalion commander, Fred Copeman, also described immense outrage. Why, men asked, was it possible that these people could obtain arms and even tanks so far in the rear when the front line was starved of ammunition? But overwhelmingly reliant on propaganda, it is perhaps not that surprising that many in the British battalion reacted with such hostility. It was extremely difficult, if not impossible, for those on the front line to obtain objective news. Their post was censored, and newspapers were essentially restricted to those that put across the official party line. As one volunteer described, we were not too well informed. Newspapers, Spanish or British, came to us in a hit or miss way, often none at all for several days. Spanish papers were either the communist Mundo Obrero or the socialist El Socialista, neither noted for objective reporting. Anyway, printed in Spanish, they were, regrettably, unintelligible to 3/4 of the British. Irregularly, we saw the Daily Worker, unavoidably 7 days old, and sometimes Reynolds News, a now defunct Cooperative Party publication, which, as a Sunday paper, was likely to be even more behind events. Besides, as one volunteer openly admitted, many of the British volunteers in Spain did not really have a great understanding of Spanish politics. There was an abysmal ignorance, he said, of Spain and Spanish affairs, common to an overwhelming majority of the volunteers from Britain. Recent events have thrust the country and its people to the forefront of our political consciousness. We rightly saw their struggle as an extension of our own in Britain. We went to help to demonstrate the solidarity of working classes of other lands. But of the complexities of Spanish politics, the wide range of passionately held beliefs of so many parties, from liberals to communists, not forgetting anarchists and Trotskyists, left Republicans and separatists, we knew little or nothing. Even a senior figure such as Len Crome mentioned earlier, the chief medical officer for the entire 35th Republican Division, declared that he knew little personally of what was actually happening in Barcelona, and therefore took on trust the information he was given. I was very badly informed about it all, he said. I wasn't taking too much interest either, you know. At the front, in the army, we didn't know what was happening. the International Brigades were run by communists, and I believed what I was told. But while the members of the battalion in the trenches were too busy fighting Franco's forces to be personally involved in the May events in Barcelona and the victimisation of the POUM and the IRP which followed, there is no doubt that several British Party members did play a part. The university student David Crook, who had been wounded at Jarama, had been sent to officer training school after recovering from his wounds. Whilst convalescing, Crook was approached by George Orwell, a Soviet agent working for the communist newspaper Franco, who recruited him for Republican military intelligence. Crook was charged with befriending and reporting on members of the POUM, and he also spied on those involved with the British IRP group, the commander George Cobb, the British Independent Labour Party leader John McNair, and of course the Orwells. Crook inveigled himself into the offices of the IRP in Barcelona, where he copied documents and passed them on to the Russian embassy and to his handler Sean, probably Hugh O'Donnell, who's working in a kind of clandestine capacity for the Socialist Party of Catalonia. O'Donnell alluded to his work in a letter to Harry Pollitt in the spring of 1937. He said, "My work consists of looking after the English-speaking people passing through Barcelona and keeping track of those in Barcelona. I should explain that the nature of my work cannot be fully explained in a letter, and that much of it is of a character which can only be undertaken by a party comrade who has previous experience in this work." Other British volunteers were also prepared to play their part if required. En route to Spain at the end of May 1937, one Scot was part of a group of volunteers who were approached in France by a Spanish emissary to discuss the significance of the Barcelona May Days. The Scottish volunteer was quite clear how he felt about the POUM, arguing that it was causing obstructions to the unification process needed to fight the war. It was a Trotskyite party that was open to any provocateur to enter, he said. The band of volunteers was asked a simple question. If the situation in Barcelona worsened, would we go to the support of the government to help put an end to that situation in Barcelona? The answer was clear. Without exception, the whole group agreed that we were. And many former international brigaders continued to accept the version of events portrayed in the Daily Worker for years after the Spanish Civil War. The Newcastle veteran Frank Graham remained convinced that the POUM was an enemy of the Spanish Republic. He wrote, "When on May the 4th reports reached us that the POUM, a so-called left-wing socialist party, had revolted and was trying to overthrow the government in Barcelona, we were outraged, though not surprised. For months, it was known that the leadership had been working secretly with Franco, and many of its members were former Phalangists, Spanish fascists, or fascists, who had been unable to escape to the south when Franco invaded Spain. And the former political commissar and battalion commander, Bill Alexander, always maintained that the political repression instigated by the Republic was completely justified. The Republic had to safeguard itself against internal enemies. Injustices and mistakes were inevitable, but the government erred, if anything, on the side of complacency and lack of vigilance. However, other veterans were less convinced. The former political commissar John Angus later summarised the feelings of some when he acknowledged that the POUM was perhaps not as black as it has sometimes been portrayed, though he still argued that the attitude of the anarchists in the POUM was not at all helpful to winning the war. Though not actually fifth colonists, they were, he believed, politically innocent, naive people who were very remote from reality. Now, this view is probably no longer prevalent. In fact, for many in Britain and beyond, the persecution of the POUM has become the central story of the Civil War. Drawing from their reading of Orwell, many come to believe that it was Stalin, the Communist Party, and the bitter sectarianism which was responsible for the Republic's defeat. even though Stalin's Russia was the only major power to be actually assisting the Republic. This view of the Stalinist terror in Spain was reinforced by Ken Loach's film Land and Freedom, in which Jim Allen's screenplay portrayed American International Brigaders shooting Republican militia. Furthermore, over the years it has been frequently, and quite wrongly, alleged that thousands of members of the POUM and other left-wing organisations were, like the POUM leader Andrew Nin, brutally tortured and murdered in communist prisons in Spain. In fact, as Orwell himself acknowledged, the Spanish Premier Juan Negrin and the others have kept their heads and refused to stage a wholesale massacre of Trotskyists. Considering the pressure that has been put upon them, it is greatly to their credit that they have done so. This, of course, is not to fall into the trap of arguing that Stalin was the great advocate and defender of Spanish democracy. As the historian A.J.P. Taylor has convincingly argued, it is highly unlikely that the USSR aided Spain on principle. Stalin would probably have welcomed peaceful relations with Nazi Germany if at all possible. Conflict in Spain was more welcome to the Russians than conflict near their own border, A.J.P. Taylor argued. But Stalin was determined that Spain should not become a fertile breeding ground for Trotskyists and other deviationists critical of the Soviet Union. As Angelvinas has argued, no significant aspect of communist or Soviet policies during that period can be understood without reference to the action against Trotskyism. Now, while the fratricidal purges may have contributed to demoralisation amongst the government supporters and undoubtedly damaged the Republic's reputation abroad, I would suggest that they were not the primary cause of the Republic's woes. The greater military experience and efficiency of the nationalists was significant, but it seems to me that the most dangerous obstacle facing the Republic was not Stalin's terror, but Britain and France's determination to support the farcical Non-Intervention Pact, which placed restrictions on the influx of armaments and materials to the Republic, while doing nothing to prevent German and Italian aid flooding into Franco's Spain. In fact, as the Francoist minister Pedro de Sanz Rodriguez admitted after the end of the Civil War, many Spaniards believe that we gained our victory exclusively through German and Italian aid. I am convinced that, though this did contribute, the fundamental reason for our winning the war was the English position opposing intervention in Spain.
I wonder if it's too strong to actually say that the POUM were the enemies of the Republic. They weren't as much the enemies of the Republic as the CNC, that's, I think, fairly easy to establish. But there was no way in which they were friends or natural allies of the Republic. We had all sorts of differences with the Republic, especially the bourgeois characters that ran it, almost from beginning to end, apart from the Russians and Russian stooges were involved. So really, when communists said POUM are our enemy, they weren't exaggerating, at least within their own context.
The problem is that there's two things going on, isn't there? There's the reality of what actually was happening, and then there's the perceptions and there's the reporting of what's going on in the kind of accounts of things. So clearly, the anarchists and the POUM to some extent were not supporters of parts of the Republican government in Spain, that's true. But they were, there's no doubt that the POUMistas were just as, they were staunch anti-fascists and they were fighting in just the same way that the communists were. Now, when I talk about the fact that Orwell and the ILP were fighting in a quiet sector or a quiet front, to use John Cornford's phrase, that almost sounds as though I'm being deliberately insulting about that. But of course, soldiers don't choose where they fight. They are allocated to a sector of the front. And every bit, of course, is important as every other. And there are various parts where the war flares up. Clearly, at that stage, Madrid was the kind of, it was the heart of the battle. There's no, the heart of the heart. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, it's just as important that every other part of the front is manned. And I think, yeah, they played their role in defending in the Spanish Republic, just as the communists did. There's a question about the extent of the persecution of the POUM, how, because Orwell, of course, talks about it, and the question was, you know, how, I suppose, in essence, how reliable was his account for the persecution of the POUM? Were they really persecuted? And there is no doubt that they were. There were many people thrown in jail. There were several hundred killed within the street fighting. But, as I said in the lecture itself, the idea that thousands and thousands were thrown into prison and tortured to death is just not the case. Those that were imprisoned were put on trial, and Juan Negrin, the Premier of Spain at the time, although he's often accused of being a kind of communist stooge who was just doing Stalin's work, dirty work for him, the evidence seems to suggest that actually he worked quite hard to make sure that those people who were in jail had a fair trial. So there was persecution of that, there is no doubt. But at the same time, the state apparatus of the Spanish Republican government, I don't think was compromised as perhaps some people would make out.
Volunteers who deserted from the International Brigade were also being rounded up. And he actually said in his book that the number of foreign deserters from the International Brigades in the jails was many hundreds. And we do know, which you haven't actually touched on that many deserters were actually executed by the leadership of the brigades. Marty, actually, the leader of the International Brigades, Andre Marty, the communist leader, he actually said that we executed up to 500 deserters from the International Brigades, and that was quoted by Anthony Beevor. So there was very significant repression, not just of the deserters from the brigades, but also of the POUM and the anarchists in Barcelona. And I don't think we should downplay that at all.
Right, okay. So, I'm not downplaying it at all. I fully accept that there was, and I thought I made that clear, sorry, I thought I made it clear, that indeed there was persecution of the POUM and the anarchists after, and several hundred people were killed and people were thrown into jail. But I don't seek to deny that at all. And indeed, it's also the case that there were a lot of international brigaders thrown into jail for deserting, for drunkenness, and for all sorts of crimes. But my work is on the British, and there were no British volunteers executed for desertion. It just simply didn't happen. There were two that we know of that were executed. One of them he was a deserter, but the reason why he was shot was because he was deserting with, when he was caught, he had a map of all the British machine gun positions, and I would suggest to you that that would probably happen in any army. The second one that was executed was because, whilst after a number of other incidents, blind drunk, he opened fire on a number of his own comrades, and that was taken extremely seriously, and he was shot. But neither of those were for desertion. Now, the classic quote of Andre Marty, the butcher of Albacete, has been used over the years. It's always rolled out. I say to you, produce these bodies. It is simply not the case. And Marty said all sorts of things. Now, I have absolutely no doubt that Marty was perfectly capable of bumping off 500 people. He was, by all accounts, a homicidal maniac. But what he actually said is not that he shot 500. It's been an exaggeration over the years, and it's always rolled out. If that were the case, somebody needs to produce these bodies, and that never has been done, as far as I'm aware. And Remy Skutelka's book on the brigades talks about that in great detail. I mean, I'm not attempting to downplay what happened in the brigades. There were people who got thrown in jail, and some who got thrown in for being politically deviant. I don't dispute that. But I think we need to be led by the evidence rather than, the other way around.
that would seem to me to be a good point at which to leave this first session. Thank you very much.